They say the mountains of Kentucky hold secrets older than America itself, and some so dark they were never meant to be unearthed. In 1847, a place known as Millbrook Inn stood as a beacon of hospitality in the Appalachian wilderness. Travelers spoke of warm hearths, fine whiskey, and the uncanny charm of four sisters who ran the inn with grace and devotion. But behind every smile, behind every glass of spiced wine, behind every softly spoken promise of love, there was something else, something cold and calculated, because buried beneath the mountain soil were 43 men, nameless now, devoured not by wolves or wild terrain, but by something far worse, trust misplaced in human hands. This isn't just a tale of murder, it's a ritual of manipulation, a psychological web spun by women who understood power and how to wield it in silence. What if I told you that every friendly conversation at Millbrook Inn was a test, every glance a study in control, and that these sisters, praised for their virtue, practiced a kind of social alchemy that could turn strangers into corpses without a trace of struggle? You're about to hear the story they tried to erase from history, not just because it was horrifying, but because it exposes how easy it is to twist innocence into a weapon. They operated in the shadows behind a veneer of grace, using the tools of hospitality to orchestrate death. And the world applauded their success. This isn't just a crime story, it's a blueprint for hidden power, for covert control, for how easily you can be lulled by comfort into surrendering your soul. Remember this, what you're about to hear is dangerous, because once you know the truth behind Millbrook Inn, you'll never see a friendly face the same way again. This is the beginning of the descent, the first crack in the illusion of safety, and the Cunningham Sisters were just getting started. The story begins in the spring of 1834 when the Cunningham family took possession of a secluded property deep in the Appalachian Range, land inherited from a mysterious uncle whose name had long since faded from local memory. Four sisters, Margaret, Catherine, Sarah, and Elizabeth, arrived with modest belongings and a determination to survive the frontier. To the outside world, they were orphaned women seeking refuge. In reality, they were architects of something far more sinister. Margaret, the eldest, possessed an icy intelligence. Catherine wielded charisma like a weapon. Sarah, quiet and methodical, had a fascination with medicinal herbs. And Elizabeth, the youngest, watched and learned. Together they transformed the rugged homestead into Millbrook Inn, an oasis for weary travelers. But the isolation was no accident. It was the first layer of control. The mountains weren't just a backdrop, they were accomplices, silent witnesses to what would come. As the inn grew in reputation, the sisters became beloved figures in the community. They donated to churches, aided the sick, and entertained guests with grace and laughter. But beneath the floorboards, they hid the tools of death, poisons, ropes, and ledgers marked not with names, but with numbers. Each number, a life taken, and each life, a means to an end. They studied their guests. They knew who carried gold, who had no family, who could vanish without question. These weren't random killings. This was a system, calculated, deliberate, and perfected over years. The sisters didn't see themselves as murderers, they saw themselves as survivors, superior beings who mastered the art of exploitation, and they believed the world owed them for the hardships they'd endured. This was not desperation, this was vengeance cloaked in civility, and the body count began to rise, unnoticed, unchallenged, until one man, a railroad surveyor, stumbled too close to the truth, and the facade of Millbrook Inn began to crack. What he found would change everything, but not before the sisters claimed more souls. You're only beginning to understand the darkness here. Stay with me, because the descent has only just begun. The railroad brought progress, but it also brought eyes. In 1845, surveyor Jonathan Waverley arrived at Millbrook Inn, tasked with mapping terrain for a proposed rail line that would cut through the mountains. He was a man of numbers, not stories, a mind sharpened by solitude, uninterested in gossip or community. To the sisters he was perfect, alone, well-paid, and untraceable. Catherine greeted him first, her charm disarming, her gaze unreadable. She spoke of local herbs, of trails winding through the hills, of secrets the land whispered only to those who listened. Waverley, fascinated by her knowledge, lingered longer than planned. He began to trust. That was always the first step. Sarah prepared his meals, each dish spiced with small, almost imperceptible doses of toxin derived from the destroying angel mushroom, a killer that mimicked the symptoms of mountain fever. Waverley grew ill just as planned. His maps and surveying tools worth a fortune vanished into Margaret's vault. His name faded from records. Another perfect disappearance. Another body in the sealed cave. No witnesses, no outcry, just silence and profit. And yet Waverley's death had a ripple effect. The rail project stalled, officials grew curious, and the sisters, once invisible, began to feel the first stirrings of scrutiny. But they had become experts in the art of illusion. They used their wealth to gain influence. They donated to local schools, hosted events for the community. Margaret even joined the regional merchant board. Their public lives became armor, shielding them from suspicion. And yet they knew. They could not kill forever. Each death brought them closer to exposure. But the hunger, both for power and the thrill of dominance, was stronger than fear. They believed they could outwit anyone, that they were untouchable, but even they could not predict betrayal from within. Remember this: evil rarely collapses from outside attack. It implodes from a crack in its own foundation, and for the Cunningham sisters that crack would soon come in the form of one man's guilt and a truth too heavy to bury. Are you ready to go deeper? Because the abyss is calling, and we are not turning back. The storm began with a whisper, not from lawmen or wary townsfolk, but from beneath the roof of Millbrook Inn itself. Heinrich Zimmer, silent, obedient, broken, had reached his edge. The younger of two German brothers employed by the Cunninghams, Heinrich had served for years as their errand man, their quiet accomplice, but darkness festers in silence, and Heinrich's silence was eroding. In the fall of 1849, he suffered a hunting accident, a wound that never healed. Sarah gave him laudanum for the pain, but the opiate did more than numb his body. It tore open his mind. Night after night he saw them, the faces of the dead. 43 men standing over his bed, eyes hollow, accusing. He heard their voices in the wind. He saw their corpses in his dreams. And one cold February morning, Heinrich came to Sarah in the kitchen, his face pale, hands shaking. "I see them," he whispered, "every time I close my eyes." Sarah, calculating, stayed calm. She tried to soothe him, offer more laudanum, promise they would talk later. But in her mind, a decision crystallized. Heinrich was no longer an asset. He was a liability. That night, she cooked for the Zimmer brothers. Spiced wine, Heinrich's favorite, laced with foxglove extract, a poison that mimics heart failure. He died in his sleep, quiet as so many of their guests had. Klaus, the older brother, survived. He had drunk less, but he woke weakened, his heart damaged, his trust fractured. And though he did not speak, yet he watched, and he remembered. The sisters had crossed a line. They had killed one of their own, not for money, not for power, but to preserve the silence that kept their empire intact, and in doing so they had set in motion the very collapse they feared. Klaus Zimmer, broken but alive, would become the fuse, his grief, the spark, his guilt, the flame, and once lit it would burn through every lie they had ever told. You see, darkness breeds in secrecy, but it dies in exposure, and soon the light would come, but not before one more man vanished, one final mistake, one misstep that would bring the entire house of death crashing down. Stay close now, we are entering the final act, and the truth cannot be unlearned. March 1851. A man named Samuel Hartwell rode up the winding path to Millbrook Inn, unaware that his name would soon be etched into the annals of forbidden history. A cotton broker from Savannah, Hartwell was no stranger to danger. He had survived financial ruin, the death of his wife, and the treacherous routes of southern trade. But none of that prepared him for the quiet terror waiting behind the Cunningham Sisters' doors. He carried with him over $1,000 in gold and banknotes, a fortune in those days, intended for business dealings in Pennsylvania. Catherine welcomed him personally, offering the warm hospitality for which the inn was known. Her smile, genuine in appearance, masked the calculations unfolding behind her eyes. Hartwell fit their profile perfectly. A man alone, wealthy, with no immediate ties to the region. He would not be missed, at least not immediately. His fate was sealed before he took the first sip of Sarah's restorative tonic. For days they wove their web. Catherine offered companionship. Her attention flattered him, disarmed him. Margaret logged his movements, financial details, and potential assets in her ledger. Sarah began introducing subtle toxins to his food, mimicking the onset of heart trouble, a plausible death, an expected tragedy. But this time, something shifted. Hartwell was meticulous. He had arranged a meeting in Pittsburgh with a textile magnate, a man who expected him at a precise time. When Hartwell failed to appear, inquiries began. Small at first, but persistent. His associate sent letters, then wired for information. Local authorities were contacted. Sheriff Thomas Brennan of Millbrook County took the case. A cautious, observant man hardened by 2 decades of law enforcement. When he questioned the sisters, they produced their usual evidence, a clean guest registry, stories of Hartwell's departure toward the north, and reassurance that all was well. But Brennan wasn't like the others. He noticed details. The timing didn't add up. Witnesses contradicted the departure date. A blacksmith recalled shoeing Hartwell's horse days after he was allegedly gone. A merchant sold supplies to someone matching Hartwell's description, but the timeline was wrong. Doubt was planted, and doubt, once rooted, grows fast. Brennan began connecting dots. Disappearances, men last seen at the inn, patterns that had long been ignored. And in the shadows, Klaus Zimmer watched it unfold, the guilt festering, the secrets burning inside him like a second poison. The sisters' perfect illusion was cracking, and soon the dam would break. Stay vigilant. The descent has begun. Sheriff Thomas Brennan didn't sleep the night after questioning the Cunningham sisters. Something gnawed at him, a sense that he'd stood at the edge of something vast, something monstrous, and stared into the void. The Millbrook Inn had always been an enigma, prosperous, respected, yet curiously untouched by the chaos of frontier life. Brennan, seasoned in the dark truths men keep, trusted his instincts. And his instincts screamed that something was deeply wrong. He began digging, not literally, not yet, but through records, correspondences, whispers in taverns, fragments of old stories long thought meaningless. Names emerged, and with them dates. Travelers last seen heading toward Millbrook, never heard from again. 15 cases in 20 years. Coincidence? Or a buried truth clawing its way back to the surface? Brennan needed more. He turned to the one person closest to the sisters who wasn't blood, Klaus Zimmer. On the surface, Klaus was loyal, strong, silent. But inside, he was splintering. The death of his brother, Hinrich, haunted him. His trust in the sisters had been absolute, forged in years of service, obedience, fear. Yet now shadows lingered over every memory. When Brennan approached him in town under the guise of casual conversation, Klaus hesitated. But grief is a cruel teacher, and the weight of what he had seen, what he suspected, could not be contained forever. "The mountains hold many secrets," Klaus murmured, his eyes distant. "Not all of them should stay buried." Brennan knew then. Klaus was ready to break. In a secluded meeting, away from Millbrook's watchful eyes, fragments of confession began to spill forth. Klaus could not say the word murder, not yet, but his stories of late-night activity, strange burials, and Hinrich's torment painted a picture darker than any Brennan had seen. It was enough. Warrants were issued. The raid was planned. Dawn, April 15th, 1851, the day the veil would be lifted. Armed deputies surrounded Millbrook Inn, cutting off escape. Brennan stood at the door, face carved from stone, knowing that behind it lay decades of carefully hidden death. Margaret greeted him, mask intact, her voice calm, even welcoming. Catherine wept. Sarah remained silent, a storm behind her eyes. Elizabeth trembled. But lies have a weight, and the sisters were now drowning. Behind those walls, the truth awaited, a truth soaked in blood, betrayal, and cold calculation. And Brennan was ready to uncover every last piece. This is how it begins, the unraveling of the perfect crime. Step deeper with me. There is no turning back. They say the devil's greatest trick was convincing the world he didn't exist. At Millbrook Inn, the Cunningham Sisters had done one better. They had made the world believe they were saints. Inside the walls of that inn, Sheriff Brennan and his men began their search, eyes sharp, hearts pounding, uncertain what horrors they might uncover. What they found was beyond even their darkest suspicions. First came the artifacts, personal effects belonging to the missing, tucked away as if trophies in a twisted shrine to vanished lives. A silver pocket watch, engraved initials worn smooth by anxious hands, letters never sent, some half-written, words frozen in time. Then came Sarah's garden. To the townsfolk, it was a place of healing, where rare herbs cured fevers and injuries. But Brennan knew poison when he saw it. Belladonna, foxglove, monkshood, plants that kill, carefully cultivated, thriving in the shade of deception. In Sarah's private room it grew darker still. Her journals, meticulous, scientific, cold, detailed the effects of each toxin, the dosages, the symptoms. Page after page charted death like a ledger of the damned. Specific victims were cross-referenced to specific poisons, a clinical record of murder hidden behind medicinal pretense. Still, the sisters denied everything. Margaret accused Brennan of overreach. Catherine sobbed and begged for mercy. Elizabeth remained a silent shadow. But Brennan wasn't done. Guided by Klaus, they uncovered the entrance behind the rockfall. The air inside was stale, thick with the weight of the unspeakable. And there, in the dim lantern light, lay the remains. Bones stacked like cordwood, personal items scattered like relics of a lost pilgrimage. 43 men, each with a story that ended in that cold, forgotten cave. The silence was deafening. Some had been stabbed, puncture wounds revealing surgical precision. Others showed signs of suffocation or blunt trauma. And a few, the most horrifying of all, bore the chemical scars of slow, agonizing poison, murder by inches delivered by the hands of a healer. The spell of Millbrook Inn was shattered. The sisters, once paragons of virtue, stood exposed as predators, masters of death cloaked in charm and civility. Brennan's men emerged from that cave forever changed, their eyes haunted. The world had shifted. Evil no longer wore horns or wielded blades. It served tea, sang hymns, and smiled sweetly while sealing your fate. And this was just the beginning of the reckoning. Stay close. We're going deeper. The trial of the Cunningham Sisters wasn't just a courtroom spectacle. It was a reckoning centuries in the making. Word spread like wildfire. Newspapers called it the most diabolical conspiracy ever uncovered on American soil, but the headlines barely scratched the surface. This wasn't merely about murder. This was about control. How 4 women, bound by blood and ambition, bent the world to their will through charm, deception, and calculated terror. In court, Margaret stood like stone, her gaze unblinking, refusing to flinch as the tide of evidence crashed over her. She denied everything, claimed the items were planted, the records forged, that powerful enemies sought to destroy their family's legacy. Catherine was a different storm. One moment she sobbed, the next she raged, her words tangling into confessions and denials, implicating her sisters, then begging the court to understand. Sarah? Silent. Not a single word, just that cold, fixed stare. It was Elizabeth, the youngest, who pleaded for mercy. Her voice trembled as she claimed she'd been manipulated, coerced, nothing more than a pawn in her sister's hands. But the jury didn't see innocence. They saw complicity. The prosecution laid bare the horrors of Millbrook Inn. Witnesses spoke of the charm, the hospitality, the perfection. Then came the artifacts. The watch, the letters, the maps, each linking a vanished man to that cursed place. Sarah's journals sealed their fate, detailed scientific records of death, each victim catalogued, each toxin documented, not chaos but cold, systemic execution. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours. Guilty, all four. Margaret, Catherine, Sarah sentenced to hang, Elizabeth life without parole. On October the 12th, 1851, the executions took place beneath a grey, rain-heavy sky. Hundreds watched, drawn by a mix of morbid curiosity and righteous vengeance. Margaret faced death without word, without a tear. Catherine and Sarah stood together on the scaffold, hands clasped, a final gesture of twisted unity. The ropes tightened, the trapdoors fell, and the Millbrook legacy was severed in an instant. Elizabeth was locked away, her life draining slowly behind iron bars, her pleas fading into obscurity. Justice had been served, or had it? Because even as their bodies were laid to rest, the land remembered. And some truths, the darkest ones, refused to die. The story wasn't over. Not yet. And the deeper we go, the more terrifying it becomes. Stay with me. This is where it begins to unravel. When the rope snapped tight that October morning, many believed evil had been extinguished. The crowd dispersed, satisfied that justice had prevailed. But Millbrook Inn wasn't just a crime scene, it was a monument to something far older, more insidious. You see, places like that don't just spring from greed or madness, they are born from decay. Moral, societal, even spiritual decay, and when investigators began tracing the sisters' fortune, the rot went deeper than anyone dared imagine. Their wealth wasn't merely the sum of stolen goods and buried corpses, it was a spider's web, reaching across states, embedded in banks, land deeds, shipping companies. Over $50,000 in assets, enough to rival established elites. But more unsettling were the allies they had. Records showed political donations, secret business partnerships, investments in railroads, riverboats, and land speculation companies, many of which had powerful men as silent beneficiaries. These weren't just victims, they were clients, enablers, even protectors, men who turned a blind eye, who profited as long as the bodies stayed buried and the gold kept flowing. Some say the sisters didn't act alone, that they were part of something larger, a hidden network operating under the guise of progress and commerce. When Millbrook Inn was seized and sold at auction, the new owners tried to erase its past. They failed. Guests refused to stay. Staff heard whispers at night, felt unseen hands, found bones in the woods. Eventually the buildings were razed. A mining company took the land, but even they couldn't bury what had been unearthed. The copper mine, where the remains were found, was sealed by court order. A stone marker was placed, no names, no epitaph, just the words, "Here lie unknown travelers, 1832-1851. That stone stands today, cold, unspoken testament to the 43 known dead. But what if I told you there may have been, and more? Ground-penetrating radar in the 1980s revealed anomalies, unmarked graves, hidden pits, never excavated, sealed by law, perhaps by fear. Are these the final secrets of Millbrook Inn, or the beginning of something else entirely? We are not merely uncovering a crime, we're peeling back the skin of a system that thrives in darkness. And now that you've seen the edge, are you willing to fall deeper? Comment the phrase, "Truth buried twice" below. Once for those lost, once for your awakening. This journey is far from over. Let me ask you, who profits from silence? Who gains when the truth is buried under stone, sealed in forgotten minds and erased from the ledgers of polite history? The tale of the Cunningham Sisters was never meant to be known beyond whispers, but here's the truth. They were not anomalies. They were a glimpse, a symptom. The Millbrook Inn was one outpost in a network of hidden places, quiet havens where dark transactions unfolded far from law, light, or morality. The sisters may have wielded the blade, mixed the poison, whispered the final lullabies to dying men, But behind them stood shadows. Wealthy investors who bought up their land cheap after the scandal, politicians who passed laws to prevent recurrence while hiding their own complicity, and businessmen who used their crimes as leverage, blackmail currency in a world where loyalty is bought and sold like livestock. Consider this. The Sisters' guest registry contained names of men from Charleston, Richmond, Baltimore, Boston, men who disappeared, yes, but also men who returned. Enriched, empowered. What were they buying? What secrets did they leave behind in exchange for silence? Some say the Sisters ran more than an inn. They ran information. Personal letters, maps, deeds, contracts all vanished with their victims, but fragments surfaced later in other hands used to tip land deals, influence elections, and sabotage rivals. The Millbrook Inn, in this light, wasn't merely a house of death. It was a vault of leverage, a black ledger for the corrupt elite. The trial, it sanitized the story, presented the Sisters as lone wolves, isolated, deranged, but what if they were pawns, used, then sacrificed when their usefulness ended? Remember Heinrich Zimmer, the man who broke under guilt. His death was swift, silencing the one man who knew where the bodies, both literal and figurative, were buried. His brother Klaus vanished, a GHE. Ost Ezra Hawthorne, dead in custody, still claiming ignorance, and Elizabeth, the last sister, locked away for life. Not one word from her before death, not one confession, no written account, as if someone somewhere ensured silence. Ask yourself who benefits when no one speaks. Comment again, truth buried twice. Speak it into the algorithm, speak it for the lost, and ask yourself who is still burying the truth today. When Sheriff Brennan stood before the crumbling stone walls of Millbrook Inn, he believed he was chasing one missing man. What he uncovered was a machine, an engine of death fine-tuned by years of practice, protected by the very society it preyed upon. The Sisters had orchestrated more than murder. They curated trust. Their charm was a weapon, their charity, a disguise. They were invited into the homes of the powerful, celebrated in church pews, and held up as paragons of frontier resilience. Brennan's investigation peeled back the veneer, but only just. The first crack came not from bones or poisons, but from a simple pocket watch. Samuel Hartwell's, still ticking in the drawer of Sarah's room. It should have been destroyed, melted down, hidden. Instead, it sat there like a taunt, as if the Sisters believed they were untouchable, or as if they had already been promised protection. Brennan dug deeper. What he found were patterns. Letters of introduction written by prominent men in Savannah and Charleston, introducing Hartwell to the Sisters, encouraging his stay. Coincidence or coordinated? Among the papers seized were names, some crossed out, some underlined. Guest names never reported missing. These were not just visitors, some were repeat patrons, men of influence. What had they witnessed? What had they purchased? Their silence is louder than screams. Brennan compiled his evidence, but before he could issue warrants, 3 witnesses disappeared. A stable boy drowned. A local storekeeper vanished on a delivery run. A midwife who had treated sick guests found dead in her bed. All ruled accidents. But Brennan knew better. This was cleanup, and the Sisters, despite being surrounded, remained calm. Margaret's final words to Brennan chilled him. "Sheriff, some truths are heavier than coffins. Are you sure you want to carry them?" It wasn't fear, it was certainty. She knew what he was risking. When Brennan testified at the trial, his voice faltered not from nerves, but from the weight of what he could not say. Evidence sealed, testimonies redacted, orders from above. The nooses silenced the Sisters, but not the legacy. Their black book vanished from evidence. Their land sold to a mining syndicate connected to a Richmond banker who had once stayed at Millbrook, signing his name in that ledger. Remember this, justice can be a mask, worn to hide deeper crimes. What else was buried, Sheriff, and what did you choose not to reveal? In the weeks after the execution, the air around Millbrook Inn seemed to shift, thick with a silence that was not peace but a warning. The land, once bustling with carriages and laughter, lay still beneath a sky that had watched too much. Locals spoke in hushed tones, and few dared approach the property. Those who did swore they felt watched, as if the soil itself remembered. But there was unfinished business, because the inn was more than a house of death. It was a vault, a repository of secrets too valuable to be left to rot. The mining syndicate that acquired the land was no random bidder. The Richmond banker who orchestrated the purchase had long been connected to frontier investments, war financing, and land seizures. He wasn't just buying property, he was erasing a crime scene. Within weeks, demolition crews arrived, but they didn't begin with the inn. They began underground, sealing the mine, blocking access, removing hazardous materials. Witnesses reported wagons leaving under cover of darkness, escorted by armed men, their contents hidden beneath tarps. What were they removing? Theories abounded. Gold, documents, maps, even bodies. One worker, before disappearing himself, claimed they found chests, filled not with coin but with letters and ledgers, proof of a wider network that had funded the sisters, used their services and ensured their silence. Think about it. How did 4 women build such wealth, acquire such protection, and maintain perfect discretion, alone? Or were they part of something larger, a system that required certain men to vanish, certain secrets to be silenced? The inn was a tool, and tools are only as valuable as the hands that wield them. Some believe Millbrook was a frontier experiment, a microcosm of control. The guests weren't just victims, they were assets, liabilities, or messengers. Catherine didn't seduce just for pleasure, she extracted information. Sarah didn't poison merely for profit, she studied reactions. And Margaret, she wasn't a mad woman, she was a strategist. Every death served a purpose beyond gold. Surveillance, interdiction, disruption. Hidden history whispers this: the sisters may have fallen, but the system endured. The land was repurposed. The documents, if real, disappeared into private archives. The banker who bought Millbrook expanded his empire, eventually funding railroads that cut through the very mountains where 43 men vanished. What was the cost of progress? What truth was paved over? And how many more inns, forgotten now, served the same purpose in other shadows? But what if the 43 were just the visible sacrifice? What if beneath those shallow graves, beneath the bones and trinkets, lies a deeper truth, the kind carved into the bedrock of history yet scrubbed clean from public memory? In 1852, a year after the execution, a lone surveyor named Elias Monroe returned to the site of Millbrook under contract to map mineral veins for future industrial use. What he found was not copper nor coal, but a chamber, hidden beneath the cave where the bodies had been sealed. This chamber was not natural. The walls were etched with symbols, ancient, indecipherable, yet unmistakably deliberate. Alongside these markings were iron-bound crates. Monroe reported 3, filled not with gold, but with what he described in his private journal as records of men, places, and plans that should never have been known. These crates vanished shortly after Monroe's discovery. He submitted his findings to the mining company, only to be dismissed and discredited. Within a month, Monroe was dead. His body, found near the Ohio River, ruled a suicide. But fragments of his journal survived, passed down in his family, smuggled into private collections, and in one chilling entry he wrote, "Millbrook was not the beginning. It was a node, a station in a network of disappearance. The sisters were chosen, not by chance but by design. They knew the price of silence." This revelation redefines the story. The Cunningham sisters were not simply predators. They were agents, either willing or coerced, operating within a clandestine framework. Their skills, poison, seduction, manipulation, were cultivated. Their victims, men of property, of knowledge, of influence, were selected not just for wealth but for what they carried, what they knew. Think about it. How does a mountain inn become a black hole of human lives without drawing more suspicion, unless someone benefits from the emptiness it creates? And who were these beneficiaries? Not just locals, not just merchants, but institutions, those that thrive in darkness, banks that seized the lands of the dead, railroads that laid track over forgotten corpses, lawmen who turned away and officials who promoted them. The Millbrook Inn then becomes a mirror, a reflection of a system that sacrifices the few for the profit of the hidden elite. And if it happened there, in one forgotten corner of Kentucky, where else did it happen? Where is it still happening now? Let's pull the veil further back, because the sisters, for all their cunning, were not the masterminds. They were pawns, perhaps queens on the board, but still directed by unseen hands. A letter, recovered from Sarah Cunningham's private collection held in code, was deciphered in 1912 by a Civil War cryptographer's grandson. It was addressed not to a friend or lover, but to a man known only as H.B. The contents? Orders. Specific detailed instructions on how to handle the arrival of certain guests, dates, names, even items of interest to be confiscated quietly. The tone was not of negotiation but command. Ensure Waverley's maps reach the council by month's end. Avoid delay. Disposal must be clean. The council. That word, easily dismissed, but echoed in other hidden correspondences. And what was this council? Clues point to a clandestine body operating across the eastern seaboard in the early 1800s. Not politicians, but a blend of industrialists, former military officers, and occult scholars. Men who believed in control through fear and knowledge. Their goal? To chart and control the untamed frontier, not just the land, but the people who dared traverse it. Every guest at Millbrook Inn wasn't merely a traveler. They were data points, risks to be neutralized, assets to be seized. The sisters' real trade wasn't hospitality. It was information harvesting and strategic elimination. A ledger found in Margaret's quarters confirms this. Not a guest book, but a dossier. Notations on affiliations, secrets confessed under the influence of alcohol or seduction, and assets carried on their person. This was surveillance before the age of wiretaps, and it was sanctioned by those who sat above law, beyond government. The sisters weren't outlaws, they were operators in a larger game of domination, and their inn, a theater of shadows where lives were traded for power. But the council didn't fee. Their methods evolved, the Millbrook blueprint was replicated, refined. Today it's not poison, it's distraction. Not inns, but digital realms. The question is, are we the guests now? Are we being profiled, harvested and discarded in ways we fail to see? Comment: I see the shadow in the mirror twice. Lock it in. Once seen, the mask never fits again. Welcome to the second veil. When Sheriff Brennan stepped onto the grounds of Millbrook Inn that April morning, he wasn't just entering a crime scene. He was walking into a carefully crafted illusion, one designed to fracture the mind and dissolve certainty. The sisters greeted him with perfect grace, their smiles unbothered, their eyes devoid of fear. Behind them stood Ezra Hawthorne, the loyal hunter, eyes hollow with the weight of secrets too long carried. Brennan's instincts screamed that he was being watched, not by the sisters, but by something else, something that lived within the very walls of Millbrook. Every corner of that place seemed to breathe, to whisper. It was more than stone and timber. It was a repository of agony, soaked in blood and shadowed by a presence that felt ancient. As his men searched the property, Brennan was led by Klaus Zimmer, pale, shaking, broken, to a rockfall at the edge of the forest, one he claimed had shifted in a storm. What lay behind it was not just a cave, it was a vault of horror. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic sting of death. Bones, dozens of them, arranged with grim precision, each skeleton marked by trauma, some with shattered skulls, others with signs of prolonged suffering. And among the remains, objects, watches, rings, letters, proof of identities erased, lives consumed. But something else lay deeper, embedded in the cave wall, a symbol, carved into stone with obsessive care, an Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail, surrounded by runes of unknown origin. This wasn't just a burial site, it was ritual, purposeful, ancient. Brennan took sketches, which were later analyzed by scholars and dismissed as gibberish, yet those symbols match carvings found in megalithic sites across Europe and in ruins deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The implication? The sisters weren't just part of a criminal conspiracy. They were vessels of an older power, one that predated the founding of America, one that had found fertile ground in isolation and secrecy. What Brennan uncovered threatened not only the sisters but the entire structure that protected them. Within days of the discovery, anonymous warnings were sent to his home, his family placed under constant guard, and then silence. No more letters, no threats. Just a sense that he had looked too deep into the abyss, because Millbrook Inn wasn't just a place of death, it was a node in a network of ancient control. The sisters were only the beginning. Brennan's discovery should have ended the nightmare, but instead it opened a door he could never close. That night he didn't sleep. How could he? He'd seen the bones, he'd seen the symbol, and most disturbingly, he'd seen the journal. The one hidden beneath the floorboards of Margaret Cunningham's quarters, wrapped in oilskin, its pages filled with ink, blood, and madness. The writings weren't just records, they were invocations. Margaret described her guests not as victims but as offerings, currency for some force she referred to only as the Veiled One. Each name, each date, was followed by a ritual detail: herbs burned, poisons administered, words whispered at midnight. But the entries that chilled Brennan's blood were the ones that didn't name victims but visitors. Figures who came to Millbrook not to die but to observe. Men cloaked in anonymity, leaving no record, but offering payment in gold coins minted in 1799 with no nation's insignia. Who were they? What did they want from the sisters? Brennan brought these findings to Richmond, to the Attorney General's office, but instead of praise he was met with cold resistance. The evidence vanished into sealed files. He was warned, bluntly, to stop. The phrase used haunts the margins of his personal notes. The Republic is not prepared for such truths. Still, Brennan pushed forward. He began tracing the sisters' financial records, uncovering a web of investments that stretched far beyond Millbrook. Land holdings in Pennsylvania, a distillery in Maryland, and most curiously shares in a shipping company operating along the Ohio River, linked to other missing persons cases spanning 3 states. The same pattern emerged. Isolated locations, charismatic owners, disappearances explained away as frontier misfortunes. Was Millbrook Inn a lone aberration or part of a network of death? Brennan wasn't the only one asking. Letters began arriving at his office, unsigned, typed on strange parchment. They warned him to cease his inquiries. The balance must be maintained. Days later, his deputy went missing. Found weeks after in the forest, his mouth sewn shut, his hands severed, a crude Ouroboros carved into his chest. It was no longer just about the sisters. Brennan realized that the corruption wasn't local, it was systemic, institutional, protected. And the truth he had stumbled upon wasn't just dark history. It was forbidden. At that moment, Brennan had a choice. Turn back and live in willful ignorance, or continue and become a target. He chose to continue, and the descent only deepened. In the months following the trial, Brennan's life transformed into a waking nightmare. He was no longer an investigator, he was the hunted. His home was watched, his mail intercepted, and his closest allies withdrew in fear. But Brennan had become possessed, not by madness, but by clarity. He saw the pattern everywhere now: hotels, inns, remote estates, all with histories of unexplained disappearances, all operated by families with long, unbroken ties to wealth, land, and secrecy. He called them the Keepers, and Millbrook Inn was merely one node in a sprawling lattice of power, money, and sacrifice. But what were they keeping? His answer came in the form of a manuscript, sent anonymously, no return address. A translated text called The Doctrine of Shadows, purportedly a lost section of the Codex Gigas, the Devil's Bible. In it, the writer described a covenant made in ancient times. Those who fed the Veiled One would be granted prosperity, influence, and protection from the laws of men. The price? Blood. Consent was irrelevant. Only the ritual mattered. Brennan's skepticism broke under the weight of what he had already seen. The poison gardens, the symbols, the uncanny timing of the sisters' fortunes. It wasn't just greed, it was a pact. And it had worked. But here's where the story turns. Brennan, no longer content with simply exposing the truth, sought to understand it. He traveled to Kentucky, Pennsylvania, even the Ohio River towns linked to the sisters' investments. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Other establishments, eerily similar to Millbrook, all abandoned now, but saturated with signs of similar operations: hidden compartments, forged registries, and burial sites never recorded by any local authority. In each, he found relics, talismans inscribed with languages he could not decipher, documents signed by names that recurred across decades. These names weren't just aliases. They were titles, positions within an order. And at the top of every document, always the same seal, a serpent devouring its own tail crowned with 7 thorns. Brennan realized he had uncovered not a conspiracy, but a continuum, a lineage of control passed silently through generations. What the Cunningham sisters had done wasn't unique. It was permitted, and those who had permitted it still walked free, hidden in plain sight, cloaked in the armor of wealth and respectability. This was no longer about justice. It was about revelation. If you're still watching, this is the point of no return. Comment, "I see the serpent" twice below to lock your identity into this path. What comes next will change you. Brennan's investigation into the wider network of establishments did not go unnoticed. One night in late autumn of 1852, he returned to his modest home outside Charleston to find the door ajar, the lock splintered. Inside, nothing was stolen, but everything had been moved, books rearranged, documents missing, and worst of all, his notes on the Cunningham sisters were gone. On his kitchen table lay a single object, Hartwell's pocket watch, the same watch catalogued as evidence and secured in a federal facility months earlier. Now ticking steadily in the quiet gloom of his home, it signaled a message. They were watching. They knew. Brennan understood the warning. This was no longer about uncovering the truth, but about surviving it. Yet his resolve only deepened. If this order could reach into secure evidence rooms and unseal court-locked items, then it operated beyond the reach of law. That night, Brennan began transcribing everything he knew, copying documents by candlelight and hiding them in various locations. He reached out to allies in the press only to find their interests suddenly muted. Editors who had once clamored for details on the Millbrook case now refused to publish anything further. He was alone, surrounded by a wall of silence. Meanwhile, Millbrook Inn itself had become a locus of pilgrimage, not by the curious public, but by those who believed. Visitors in black carriages, strangers who left offerings at the now destroyed site, cryptic symbols carved into nearby trees, and faint chants heard by local hunters. Brennan received reports of it all. The land had become sacred ground for those who honored the sisters not as murderers, but as initiates who had fulfilled their role in the ancient pact. One night, under a pale moon, Brennan returned to the sealed copper mine where the 43 bodies had been recovered. The entrance, marked by a simple stone, now bore new carvings, unfamiliar sigils, fresh and etched with precision. He stood there for hours, feeling the weight of unseen eyes, knowing that in uncovering this story he had become part of it. Behind him, footsteps in the leaves. He turned. Nothing. Only the wind, or so he told himself. But deep down he understood. The sisters were gone, but the ritual endured. And Brennan was now entangled in a darkness far older than any inn, any trial, any law. The real story hadn't ended, it had only just begun. Brennan could no longer trust his surroundings. Every ally once reliable now seemed to avoid him. Eyes darting, voices hushed. Files he had secured under lock and key vanished or reappeared altered, scrubbed clean of incriminating evidence. But he pressed on, driven not by duty but by obsession, a need to understand why the Cunningham sisters had become agents of death cloaked in hospitality. Returning again to the last known residence of Ezra Hawthorne, Brennan discovered a journal buried beneath the floorboards of the decaying cabin. Its pages, yellowed and fragile, bore Ezra's uneven script, detailing years of service at Millbrook Inn and the changes he witnessed in the sisters. One entry chilled Brennan's blood. "They speak now in riddles, Margaret especially. She says the mountain is alive, that it listens. They offer it gifts, guests chosen not for gold, but for something deeper. Catherine says the blood feeds the earth. I fear they believe it." Ezra's journal hinted at rituals held deep in the forest at solstice and equinox when certain stars aligned. Brennan followed this lead, traversing the overgrown paths behind the old inn site. What he found was a stone circle, ancient and worn, hidden beneath centuries of forest growth. Scattered about were remnants of burnt wood, bones blackened by fire, and rusted tools that did not belong to any tradesman. At the center, a stone altar, stained dark by something that had soaked into it over years. Brennan ran his hand along the surface and felt the carved symbols, some matching those he had seen near the mine entrance. The realization hit him. Millbrook Inn had never been merely a place of profit. It was a site of offering, a conduit between this world and something older, darker. The sisters had not acted alone. They had served it, whatever it was, in exchange for protection, power, or knowledge. And now, even in death, the ground still whispered with the echoes of their pacts. As Brennan stood in the circle, a distant howl pierced the silence. Not an animal, not human, but something in between. Leaves rustled, though the air was still. He turned, heart pounding, and saw symbols glowing faintly along the stones, pulsing like a heartbeat. The altar was not dormant. It waited. For what? Brennan didn't yet know, but one thing was certain. He had stepped beyond investigation. Now he was part of the ritual, and the mountain had begun to listen. Brennan didn't sleep that night. The images of the stone circle and the symbols that pulsed beneath his fingertips replayed endlessly in his mind. By dawn, he was back at the courthouse archives, searching not for evidence of crimes, but for history, land deeds, settler journals, indigenous records, anything that might explain what the Cunninghams had tapped into. In a forgotten ledger, he uncovered the first clue. The land upon which Millbrook Inn stood was once part of an expanse known as the Hollow of Elders, long avoided by local tribes. Early European settlers, lured by fertile land and mineral wealth, took it by force, but records show that many abandoned it soon after, claiming it was ill-favored ground where livestock died and people vanished. One passage from 1772 detailed an English prospector's account. The mountain watches. My men fall ill, their minds broken. Something beneath calls. Brennan knew then that the sisters hadn't chosen Millbrook by chance. It had drawn them. When Margaret inherited the land, she found not just an inn to run, but a power to command if she dared. And she did. In a locked chest from the Cunningham estate, now sealed in the sheriff's evidence room, Brennan found Margaret's personal journal. Pages written in precise, cold script outlined her descent not into madness, but into purpose. The earth beneath Millbrook is ancient, she wrote. It is not death that dwells here, but memory, and it remembers blood. She spoke of the rite of sustenance, a ritual of offering to keep the mountain's favor and ensure their prosperity. The guests were not merely victims, they were currency. Catherine, Sarah, and Elizabeth had each embraced this truth in their own way. The food, the wine, the seduction, it was all theater for a deeper transaction. Brennan's hands shook as he read Margaret's final entry. We are not murderers. We are caretakers. He mountain chose us, and when the time comes, we shall return to it. He returned to the forest one last time, standing again in the stone circle. The air was colder now, the sky a dull iron. Beneath his feet he could almost feel the heartbeat again, slow, steady, waiting. And for the first time Brennan wondered if he had uncovered a crime or disturbed a balance. The sisters were gone, but Millbrook was not empty. The land still hungered, and he had fed it truth. After Brennan's final visit to the site, he sealed away the journal and the stone etchings under official order, claiming it was evidence in a closed case, never to be released to the public. But word had already spread. Whispers in taverns, notes exchanged between scholars, and ghost stories told in hushed voices across Western Virginia. The Millbrook Inn had become legend, yet few knew the full truth Brennan carried. The Fletcher family, who had purchased the property after the execution of the Cunningham Sisters, attempted to renovate and reopen the inn. Their efforts were brief and futile. Workers reported strange sounds, footsteps in the halls at night, voices calling from the forest, and the overwhelming stench of decay seeping from the cellar despite it being empty. On the third night of their occupancy, the youngest Fletcher son vanished without a trace. The family fled, abandoning the property. Locals refused to go near it. Brennan returned once to investigate the disappearance. Inside the abandoned structure, dust covered everything except the ledger book. It lay open on the reception desk, untouched for years, but with one fresh entry. The name scrawled in trembling ink. Samuel Hartwell. Brennan recoiled, recognizing the name of the final guest murdered by the sisters. There was no explanation, No footprints, no signs of intrusion. He ordered the building condemned. A year later, it was demolished, the land sold to a mining company. During excavation, workers unearthed the infamous cave. The remains of 43 men were exhumed, each with personal effects catalogued in detail. But beneath the cave floor, the miners struck something else, a deeper chamber sealed with stone. What lay within was never officially recorded. All reports stopped abruptly, and the mining operation was shut down under federal authority. Brennan, now aged and hollowed by what he'd uncovered, retired from public life. In his final days, he confided in a young deputy, scribbling notes no one else would see. He wrote, "Millbrook was not an inn, it was an altar. And the sisters, priests of a forgotten rite, they fed it blood and received power in return. It waits still, not for worshippers, for caretakers." After his death, those notes vanished. The land remains fenced, watched over by unmarked vehicles. Officially, it is barren, but late at night, hikers and hunters report lights in the trees and a low hum beneath the earth, like something breathing slowly, patiently. The Millbrook legacy is not over. It sleeps, and one day it will wake. In 1893, decades after the inn was destroyed and its history buried beneath official silence, a geological survey team from the Commonwealth was sent to assess the mineral viability of the old Millbrook tract. The official report would claim the land was unsuitable for excavation, but the truth was much darker. The surveyors were not told about the inn's past, only tasked with mapping underground formations. On their third day, they discovered a narrow fissure behind the sealed mine entrance, new, jagged, and oozing a faint sulfuric vapor. One of the men, Dr. Everett Langston, descended with ropes into the crevice, expecting simple mineral samples. What he found ended his life as he knew it. Langston returned shaken, his eyes hollow, claiming to have seen human remains, not skeletons but desiccated corpses, unnaturally preserved. He spoke of symbols etched into the walls, older than any known American settlement, and a pool of black water that seemed to pulse like a living heart. He never spoke again in full sentences. Langston was institutionalized weeks later, scribbling the same phrase in his notebook endlessly. They never died, they wait beneath. His fellow surveyors refused to return, and the report was falsified, declaring the land geologically unstable. But word of Langston's madness leaked, reaching the ears of secretive scholars and esoteric societies on the East Coast. Among them was Dr. Horace Winfield, an antiquarian obsessed with the occult history of early America. He traveled to the region in 1894, determined to uncover what the Cunninghams had truly been guarding. What he found has never been fully revealed, but fragments of his journals suggest he believed the sisters were part of a cult, one predating European colonization. He references rites of blood, sacrifices to the slumbering one, and rituals of power that promised wealth in exchange for lives. Winfield's last known letter was addressed to a colleague in Boston. It read, "Millbrook was never a place of rest. It was a gate. They opened it. The price was death, but the reward, unspeakable power. I fear others will seek it." Winfield vanished shortly after. His personal effects were recovered from a burnt-out cabin near the Millbrook site. Among them was a crude map marking other possible gates across America. The Millbrook Inn was not unique, it was merely the most successful. The sisters weren't mad, they were caretakers of something vast and buried, and even in their deaths, the gate remains, unwatched, unsealed, waiting. By 1901, rumors about Millbrook refused to die even as the physical location vanished beneath industrial scars. Locals whispered that the Fletcher Mining Company had not abandoned the land because of poor ore yields, but because workers vanished without trace, silent as mist. Old-timers told of voices in the fog, sounds of horse hooves echoing when no riders approached, and most chilling of all, sightings of 4 women in 19th century attire wandering the hills, always watching, never speaking. These women, described with unnerving consistency by unrelated witnesses, were said to appear near dusk, always in the same spot, what remained of the inn's foundations. The site, now overgrown and eroded, was avoided even by the boldest hunters. Meanwhile, historical interest in the Cunningham Sisters surged once again. A 1904 article in the Richmond Gazette detailed a rediscovered guest ledger from the inn found in the estate of a deceased merchant. The ledger was authentic, its pages marked with names, dates, and destinations, many of which matched missing persons reports from the same era. But beneath the visible ink, experts detected another layer. Strange sigils drawn faintly in blood, page after page. The ledger wasn't merely a record of guests, it was a record of offerings. Each sigil corresponded to ancient symbols associated with death cults from pre-Christian Europe, hinting that the sisters may have been practicing rites passed down for centuries, perhaps hidden in plain sight through the illusion of frontier piety. Then, in 1907, a flood unearthed something long buried, human remains along the banks of the nearby river, 10 miles downstream from Millbrook. Forensic examination revealed these were not part of the original 43. These bodies, weathered and cracked, dated to the same era but had never been documented. Some bore evidence of ritual death, cuts to the bones in Isis patterns, as if part of ceremonial sacrifice. Panic gripped the region again. The question arose, were there more bodies, more victims whose fates were never traced? And more disturbingly, was someone still continuing the work the sisters had begun? Sheriff records from 1908 reported strange activity. Fires seen at the Millbrook site, despite no dwellings remaining. Symbols carved into tree trunks matching those found in the ledger. Someone was returning. And as local families dug into their ancestry, disturbing connections emerged. Many descendants of Millbrook residents shared a common lineage, not to the victims, but to the sisters themselves. The bloodline had not ended, it had dispersed, and was perhaps awakening. By 1910, whispers about the Cunningham lineage stirred dread in the surrounding counties. Parish records confirmed what many feared. Margaret, Catherine, Sarah, and Elizabeth had siblings, distant cousins, even children whose names were changed, scattered, erased from official history. The truth wasn't buried in the ground, it lived in blood. A researcher named Dr. Julian Ware, a historian obsessed with the darker threads of American frontier life, published a controversial monograph titled The Sisters' Legacy, Bloodlines and Shadows. In it, he traced dozens of descendants from Millbrook families who, whether knowingly or not, bore the Cunningham mark. Birth records with false fathers, sudden disappearances of mothers, hastily arranged adoptions. He speculated that the sisters' crimes were not just acts of greed, but a continuation of ancient rites requiring legacy, blood sacrifice, and secrecy. Ware's work was dismissed by the academic elite, but in Millbrook County it sparked something darker, fear that the sisters' influence had never truly ended. Then came the fire. On November 12, 1911, the Fletcher mine, now abandoned, erupted in flame without warning. Locals watched as blue fire rose from the ground, burning not with heat, but with an eerie glow. When the smoke cleared, investigators found something chilling in the scorched earth. Charred bones arranged in a spiral surrounding a rusted iron key. No one could determine the key's purpose, but some claimed it matched the lost door to the caves where the original victims were hidden. More disturbing was the realization that the spiral pattern mimicked ancient death rites once used to bind souls, preventing them from finding peace or reincarnation. The site was sealed again, but people came anyway, drawn by rumors of visions, ghostly apparitions, and the feeling of being watched. Children reported hearing lullabies sung in unfamiliar tongues. Hunters swore they found footprints leading nowhere, always barefoot, always small, like those of women. Dr. Ware disappeared in 1912, last seen heading into the woods near Millbrook with a journal, maps, and a lantern. His remains were never found, but months later a package arrived at the Richmond Historical Society, a package containing his journal, blood-stained and torn, and a single phrase scrawled across the final page. The sisters wake. They never left, and neither did I. Authorities dismissed it as a hoax, yet none dared return to Millbrook. The darkness wasn't fading, it was growing, and the bloodline, it seemed, had no end. In 1938, the federal government sanctioned a quiet survey of the Millbrook region under the guise of geological assessment, but those sent weren't just geologists. They included agents from the newly formed FBI, historians with military clearances, and specialists in unusual phenomena from undisclosed branches. What triggered such high-level attention? A pattern, reports from different states of disappearances echoing the Millbrook Inn killings. Always the same. A lone traveler, last seen in rural lodging, vanishes without a trace. These weren't copycat crimes. They bore the same precision, same profile targeting, same eerie aftermath. What unnerved the authorities most were the dates, nearly all coinciding with lunar phases associated with ancient rituals, particularly those honoring forgotten deities tied to death and fertility. At Millbrook's former site, investigators found something beneath the ruins. A subterranean chamber untouched by the previous raids, sealed by stone and iron. Inside, they uncovered artifacts, wooden masks, ritual knives, and manuscripts in a cipher that defied translation. The chamber walls bore symbols not seen since the earliest colonial settlements, glyphs associated with old-world cults that predated Christianity. One object stood out. A cracked mirror framed in bones, believed to be of human origin. Several agents reportedly became ill after entering the chamber, plagued by hallucinations and nightmares. 2 left the agency entirely. 1 was institutionalized, repeating only one phrase, "They are the inn now." Files related to this discovery were classified indefinitely, but fragments surfaced decades later through the Freedom of Information Act. In the declassified reports, a term appears repeatedly: Operation Veil. Its goal: containment and surveillance, not of people, but of legacy, because it was clear that something had survived, whether through descendants or rituals. It was still active, adapting, moving. By the 1950s, a string of unexplained deaths in small inns across Kentucky, Virginia, and Pennsylvania revived fears. Autopsies revealed rare poisons, plants thought extinct or inaccessible. Victims had similar profiles: loners, travelers, few family ties. Authorities never released official conclusions, but a private memo between FBI officials mentioned one chilling possibility: an unbroken line of practitioners continuing the sisters' work, not for wealth, but for power, for secrecy, and for ancient obligations. The Millbrook Inn may have fallen, but its spirit had metastasized, no longer a single place, but a network, a doctrine, a curse, and somewhere, someone was still holding the key. By 1967, the legend of the Cunningham Sisters had become more than folklore. It had become a myth that walked in 2 worlds, the remembered and the real. That year, a group of university students from Richmond embarked on what they thought would be a simple historical field trip, an exploration of the Millbrook site for a thesis on Appalachian folk legends. They were warned by locals to stay away from the original grounds, that the land don't forget, but youthful arrogance dismissed the old warnings. They found the stone marker still standing, half buried in vines, weathered by time yet untouched by vandalism. Beneath their feet, the copper mine entrance, long thought sealed, had partially collapsed in recent rains, just enough to expose a narrow passage. Driven by curiosity, they entered, carrying only lanterns and notebooks. What they found inside remains a matter of dispute. Officially, 2 students fell to their deaths in a shaft, their bodies later recovered with fractured bones. But the survivors told a different story, one that university officials tried to suppress. They claimed to have found not just bones, but fresh artifacts, clothing that hadn't aged a century, boots not yet rotted, and tools still gleaming. And deeper in the mine, an alcove that seemed recently disturbed, earth moved, a stone box left open, and beside it, pages scrawled in blood or something like it. The handwriting matched samples taken from Margaret Cunningham's ledger, yet the ink was fresh. One student, a young woman named Angela Price, was found weeks later wandering a rural road 50 miles from the mine, incoherent, eyes hollow, clutching a scrap of parchment. On it, the same phrase repeated again and again: "The sisters keep watch." Angela never spoke again. Institutionalized, she lived until 1993, and in her final days began to hum an old mountain lullaby unknown to her family but Mare's, matching a tune recorded in Millbrook's church records from 1841. Since that incident, no official surveys have been conducted in the area. The mine was resealed with federal oversight. To this day, local law bars excavation without special permits. The Millbrook site has become a dead zone for mobile signals, drones fail to operate properly, and hikers report disorientation and time loss. Something lingers. Something that feeds not just on flesh, but on memory. The story of the Cunningham Sisters, it seems, did not end. It waits, buried in stone, in blood, in names whispered by those who know never to return. The years turned, but the soil never forgot. In 1975, a construction project intended to build a small lodge for tourists near the Millbrook site was quietly abandoned after only 4 weeks. Official records cite unstable terrain and budgetary concerns, but the workers who left that site refused to speak publicly, some even breaking union contracts to avoid ever returning. One man, Thomas Griggs, gave a single interview to a local paper before vanishing without a trace. In his words, "We dug into something that should have stayed buried. It wasn't just bones. It was like the land itself was alive, watching. We heard voices, women's voices, humming, sometimes laughing." Griggs disappeared 2 days after that interview, last seen boarding a bus west with no destination. His belongings were later found abandoned in a field near the original Millbrook trailhead. The article was pulled from circulation, but copies survived. In it, Griggs described seeing carved symbols on stone walls, symbols not consistent with Appalachian settler markings. A team of amateur historians later identified some of these symbols as similar to alchemical glyphs from medieval Europe, and one matched a sigil used in early Masonic rituals. How these came to be etched in a mine in remote Kentucky remains unexplained. Theories emerged. Had the sisters been more than killers? Had they uncovered or practiced something forbidden, something older than the land itself? In 1982, a documentary crew attempted to film a segment on Millbrook's haunted history. Their footage was never released. One camera operator suffered a mental breakdown during editing, insisting he had seen a figure in the background of every shot. A tall woman in 19th century dress, standing still, eyes staring through the screen. The production was shelved, but fragments of the footage leaked years later. In one scene, barely visible, is a silhouette near the stone marker. For a moment the audio warps, and a voice, faint, female, whispers, "You are already mine." Audio analysis failed to isolate the source. Since then, the Millbrook site has been declared off-limits by state authorities. No trespassing signs stand, but some still come, drawn by the legend, the lure of forbidden history. Those who return often speak of dreams, of being watched, of walking halls lit by oil lamps, of tables set for guests who never leave. The sisters are gone, but the invitation remains. Their story is not just past. It is place, it is presence, and for those who step too close, it becomes destiny. In 1994, a group of anthropology students from a nearby university attempted an unauthorized survey of the Millbrook site. Equipped with ground-penetrating radar and supported by private funding, they hoped to find further evidence of unmarked graves, confirmation that the 43 victims were only part of the true death toll. For 3 nights they camped near the ruins of the inn, now just a stone foundation covered in moss and broken timbers. On the 3rd night, something changed. One student, Eleanor Moore, documented in her journal that the group heard footsteps circling their tents, slow, deliberate, accompanied by the faint sound of fabric brushing against trees. At dawn, they discovered symbols carved into the bark of surrounding trees, identical to those once etched into the cave walls. Moore described waking to the sensation of someone standing over her, breathing. But when she opened her eyes, no one was there. The team abandoned the survey and left immediately. Their data was never published. Weeks later, Moore disappeared during a solo hiking trip in the same region. Her last known photo, taken by a park ranger, shows her standing near the Millbrook marker, eyes fixed on something beyond the frame, expression blank, almost entranced. Her body was never recovered. The incident reignited debate among local historians. Was Millbrook Inn merely the site of historic murders? Or was it a point of convergence for something older, something ritualistic? Some researchers suggested that the Cunningham sisters were not simply opportunists, but participants in a deeper, darker tradition. One theory posits that their use of poison, charm, and ritualized death echoes ancient rites meant to bind spirits, to trap power in place. A secret society, perhaps, or simply a legacy of forgotten Appalachian mysticism. In 2007, a private researcher obtained permission to conduct limited soil analysis at the Millbrook site. What he found was chilling. Traces of mercury, arsenic, and foxglove were still present in significant concentrations. More disturbingly, beneath the stone marker, fragments of bone were discovered, bones that showed signs of post-mortem alteration, cuts too fine and deliberate to be explained by decay or animal activity. The site was immediately resealed by court order. Officials cited safety and preservation concerns. But those who have studied the case know better. Something lingers at Millbrook Inn, not just the memory of murder but the echo of control, of rituals repeated in secret, of power drawn from death and maintained through fear. The Sisters' legacy is not confined to the past. It is still working, still watching, and it is not finished. In 2013, an anonymous donation was made to the Virginia State Archives, a sealed wooden crate aged and bound with iron clasps. It arrived with no return address, only a note that read, "For those who remember the mountains." Inside the crate were personal effects believed to have belonged to Elizabeth Cunningham, handwritten letters, a worn Bible, and a faded leather-bound journal. The journal, its pages brittle and ink faded, bore no signature, but the handwriting matched known samples from court records. What it contained was a revelation, a narrative that blurred the line between confession and madness. The entries began in 1852, the first year of her imprisonment, and continued sporadically for nearly 3 decades. In these writings, Elizabeth spoke of the pact, a vow made not to each other, but to something older, something the sisters had discovered in the wilderness long before the inn welcomed its first guest. She described nights spent in the forest, rituals performed by firelight, guided by symbols found carved into stone deep in the caves. She claimed the sisters had uncovered ancient texts hidden in the mountain, texts that spoke of sacrifices and the drawing of power through death. According to Elizabeth, Margaret believed they had been chosen, called to fulfill a forgotten covenant to protect the land and its secrets in exchange for prosperity and influence. The inn, she wrote, was never just a business, it was a temple. The guests who vanished were not simply victims, they were offerings. Elizabeth's journal also recounted visions, dreams filled with whispers and faces she could not recognize, but felt compelled to obey. She described how Sarah's poisons were not merely for killing, they were for silencing souls, ensuring the dead could not speak from beyond. Catherine, she claimed, had once disappeared into the woods for 3 days and returned changed, her eyes distant, her voice touched by something that wasn't entirely human. Whether these were the ravings of a guilt-ridden mind or the true account of a dark legacy, no one could say for certain. Historians debated the journal's authenticity, but its details, descriptions of hidden symbols, forgotten trails, and lost rituals, matched elements found at the site and in local folklore. The crate and its contents were quietly archived, not displayed, locked away from public view. But one archivist who briefly handled the items claimed to have found a small envelope tucked in the back of the journal. Inside was a single key, iron and cold to the touch, with a tag that read, "For the door beneath the earth." The meaning remains unknown. Years after the crate's discovery, rumors began to circulate among local explorers and amateur historians. Stories of a sealed chamber beneath the mountain, beyond the burial caves, hidden behind walls untouched for over a century. The key from Elizabeth's journal became an obsession, a relic whispered about in online forums and late-night gatherings. One group, calling themselves the Watchers of Millbrook, claimed to have found the supposed door during a covert expedition in 2018. Using old maps, soil scans, and Elizabeth's cryptic descriptions, they unearthed what they believed was the entrance, a stone archway buried under landslide debris, its surface etched with unfamiliar runes. They filmed everything, releasing fragments of their footage online. The videos showed them entering a narrow tunnel, crawling through centuries of dirt and stone, guided only by torchlight. In the final clip, they reached a massive stone door half submerged in earth, sealed tight with iron bolts and engraved with a symbol, a serpent coiled around a chalice. The symbol matched one described in Elizabeth's journal as the mark of the covenant. Then, nothing. No follow-up, no public update. The Watchers vanished. Their website went offline, social media accounts deleted, emails went unanswered. Some claimed they'd been silenced, others believed they'd gone deeper and never returned. What remains is speculation and a chilling sense of unfinished business. Locals reported strange lights in the forest, unmarked vehicles near the old inn's ruins, and faint chanting echoing through the valley on moonless nights. A new legend grew, that the Cunningham Sisters had awakened something ancient, something not meant to be disturbed, and that those who searched for their secrets risked being drawn into the same darkness. The land remains untouched, officially protected as a historical site, yet no one visits after dusk. The stone marker still stands, weathered and silent. Here lie unknown travelers, 1832 to 1851. But some say that's not entirely true, that the travelers never truly rested, that their voices still whisper beneath the earth waiting for someone to finally open the door, and if that key is ever used, if the lock ever turns, the story of Millbrook Inn will begin again, not as history, but as prophecy fulfilled. This is how dark legacies survive, not in books or records, but in the blood of the land, in the shadows of forgotten rooms, and in the minds of those who dare to remember. They say time buries all things, but the earth beneath Millbrook never forgot. In the decades that followed the Cunningham Sisters' downfall, the land became a place of silence and avoidance. Hunters refused to enter the woods. Locals passed down warnings, not written laws but spoken rituals of caution. Children were told never to wander near the ruins. Farmers claimed crops would wither if planted too close, animals would grow restless at the edge of the property, and tools left behind would vanish overnight. The Fletcher family, who once tried to salvage the inn's reputation, abandoned the land by 1873, leaving behind only broken foundations and a crumbling carriage house overtaken by ivy and moss. Yet the stories persisted, sightings of shadowy figures among the trees, voices carried on the wind, the sound of horses' hooves echoing without riders. Every generation had its own tale of someone who dared to explore the site, only to return changed, or not at all. In 1912, during a rare drought, part of the earth collapsed near the old copper mine. Inside, investigators found a hidden chamber, a root cellar long forgotten. What they found were not bodies, but shelves lined with glass jars, each sealed tight, containing what appeared to be preserved herbs and animal parts. But among them was something far stranger. Fragments of parchment covered in indecipherable script, symbols resembling alchemical sigils, and what appeared to be a crude map leading beyond the burial caves deeper into the mountain's heart. The chamber was sealed again by court order, its contents taken to Richmond, then lost in a fire in 1933 that destroyed the warehouse where they were stored. Officially, nothing remains, but some researchers claim the fire was no accident, that certain secrets, when brought to light, burn the very hands that dare to hold them. Today, Millbrook is barely a footnote in historical texts, the sisters reduced to a cautionary tale of greed and murder. But those who know, who've studied the archived court records, who've walked the land and felt its weight, understand the truth. This was never just about 4 women and their crimes. It was about something older, a darkness that used them, fed on them, and when they were gone, waited for new vessels. In the end, Millbrook Inn was never just a place. It was a threshold, and thresholds once crossed, never truly close. The mountain keeps its dead, and perhaps one day it will call for more. If this dark journey into the forgotten history of Millbrook Inn has left you questioning what else might lie buried beneath the surface of our past, then you know this was no ordinary story. Secrets like these, hidden, dangerous, forbidden, are not easily uncovered, and they're never easily forgotten. If you want more unsettling truths, more stories that were never meant to be told, then subscribe now. Share this video with someone who dares to face the shadows, and comment below, "The mountain keeps its dead." Say it twice to lock in your place among those who know. The past is full of dark corners, and we've only just begun.